One of the more interesting games of the 2010s that I never got to experience was Darksiders. And for me, a big part of the reason was simply that it was developed by THQ, a developer known for making mid-tier games like Saints Row that were occasionally fun, but were the kinds of games that you would only buy if you saw them in the used game section. And I think that's actually how I ended up playing the game for a few hours, where I just thought it was a great value God of War. And so naturally, I just kind of dismissed it and never finished the game. Yet over the years, I keep running into people who are fans of this game and franchise who swear that I need to give it a second chance. Like maybe I've just met the few Darksiders fans there are, but these are people who are so persistent and so passionate that eventually I just went, okay, I'll give it a second chance. So I bought the War Mastered Edition from the PlayStation Store, put it on its hardest difficulty, and played through the 30-hour campaign. And at the end of it all, what do I actually think? Well, it's good.
7 out of 10, I'd say.
However, I also don't feel compelled to return to this franchise anytime soon. That's because while Darksiders is definitely fun, it's also very derivative. It takes familiar elements like the combat of God of War and the level design of Zelda, and sometimes melds them into something that feels unique and refreshing. Most times though, it just felt like playing a game I had played before. If I had to summarize it, I'd say Darksiders feels like a student who copied the essay from the smartest kid in class but just changed the conclusion. And even its story isn't technically original, as it takes the first few verses of Revelation 6 and turns it essentially into a fanfiction of the Bible.
It is heresy of the highest order.
Now I am somewhat joking here, as aside from some very basic setup, the plot here is almost completely unrecognizable from what you'll find in scripture. You play as a horseman war who's falsely accused of starting the apocalypse too early. Now 100 years later, with all of humanity either being killed or turned into zombies, War has to prove his innocence or be killed for a crime he didn't commit. The story is probably the most surprising facet of Darksiders. What I expected to be some lazy, forgettable schlock turned out to be an earnestly told tale. It's clear someone put a lot of thought into creating lore for this world, and there's a sincerity to the narrative that makes me believe that this is someone's passion project. And while it didn't really land for me, I respect how much effort was put into it. And bolstering this tale are some truly memorable and well voice acted characters. War is your typical stoic action hero with a heart of gold. He could easily come across as boring, but the writers put enough personality into some of his lines that you clearly get a sense of who he is. It also helps that his voice actor is Liam O'Brien, who's done iconic roles like Gar and Osra from Ashura's Wrath. Joining War for the entirety of this journey is the Watcher, who operates essentially as War's handler and is voiced by Mark freaking Hamill. He's objectively unlikable, always pushing War to give into his darker impulses.
Do it! Tear out her heart while she still lives. I want to hear her scream!
Yet it's hard not to enjoy whenever the character is on screen, given how much personality Mark Hamill instills the character with. Other characters include an assortment of angels and demons with enough references to secret councils and dark ones to shake your head at. And while they all have a meaningful role to play, most of the time you're only dealing with a few characters who serve as a vehicle for driving War to his next objective. Now the gameplay loop is very much classic Zelda with slight Metroidvania sprinkled in. You have a sprawling overworld separated into 6 different zones, each with its own dungeon and boss. And very much like a Zelda game, you'll need to travel to all 6 zones and complete the dungeons to collect special items needed to unlock the final level. Except in Darksiders, you're not collecting pieces of the Triforce. Instead, you're ripping out the hearts of demons born from the darkest pits of hell.
Wow, that's hardcore.
Tying this all together is a combat system heavily inspired by God of War, but much more accessible than anything you'll find in Kratos' adventures. War's main weapon is a sword, the Chaos Eater, which can't be unequipped, and is utilized by simply mashing the square button. As you progress through the game and complete dungeons, you'll also gain access to sub-weapons that can be used on triangle or R2 and switched out almost instantly with a D-pad. The Chaos Blades and sub-weapons can also be modified with items that you find by exploring the world. Some of these are fairly simple, like simply allowing War to do more damage. Others are pretty cool, such as setting War's sword on fire or making it weep blood. There is also a Rage of the Gods mechanic that can turn War into a fire demon who is invulnerable from all attacks and is great for getting out of sticky situations. And if that wasn't enough, War has access to a suite of magical attacks called Wrath abilities that make sure you have an answer to any situation. Though this sounds like a lot, combat is actually relatively simple, with the game rarely asking you to do more than press one button and hold a direction to pull off a cool combo. And if I had to compare the combat to any other games, it honestly feels very similar to the Storm series one-button combat system. This isn't an insult, because War is animated with such grace and brutality that combat is never boring, and whoever designed some of these executions deserves a raise. The downside to such an accessible combat system is that war quickly feels overpowered. Even playing on the hardest difficulty, unless it was a boss fight, which can be hard for non-combat related reasons that I'll get into later, standard enemies never really push me to experiment or change my approach to combat. Now, if Zelda with good combat sounds like it'd make an excellent game, Darksiders is a solid proof of concept. For example, I was really surprised how the open world traversal of Zelda works pretty well with character action combat. Similarly, having an open world environment to simply run around and fight enemies is something I also found to be pretty enjoyable. As opposed to exclusively level or mission based systems in most character action games, having an overworld feels like you have a playground to just fight and experiment in. In other areas though, I simply don't feel like the developers really thought through how to design elements of a character action game like God of War clash with the design elements of an action adventure game like Zelda. Zelda-like dungeons simply don't lend themselves well to action heavy combat systems. That's because in order to progress these dungeons, you need to spend a majority of your time platforming, looking for keys, or solving puzzles. Combat is a marginal element to this process and can occasionally aid progress if you need to defeat a mini-boss or something, but for the most part, combat just feels like filler in between puzzle solving when you're in dungeons. This is a major problem for me because combat is by far the best part of Darksiders, even if it is a little simple. So dungeons end up feeling like they're taking your attention away from the best part of the game to focus on elements that are pretty generic. And nowhere is this clash between design philosophies more apparent than in Darksiders boss fights. For the most part, these are Zelda's puzzle or gimmick bosses which require you to use an item or do some special process to put the boss in a down state where they can be damaged. Repeat this process around 3 times and you'll beat the boss. This design works perfectly well for games with simple combat systems like most Zeldas have. With a game with more action-heavy combat like Darksiders though, this design feels overly passive, because you're spending so much time waiting for the boss to either reveal a weak point or perform the one attack that allows you to counter it. It's extremely tedious and doesn't ask the player to learn any of War's kit to overcome challenges. Instead, as long as you can recognize basic patterns and press square, you'll be able to beat any boss in this game. It says a lot that Darksiders' best boss fights have no gimmicks and simply put you in a one-on-one fight. Unfortunately, these are few and far between. Overall though, I have to really hand it to the developers, as while the level design is derivative in its structure, it is excellent in its execution. The dungeons are very well designed and show a clear understanding of how to pace these kinds of levels. You typically start by looking for a map, fight a mid-boss for your new item, and then use said item to run back to the level to interact with previously inaccessible elements. It's a tried and true formula to be sure, but it's one the developers are good at following. And it provides a steady cadence of overworld dungeon boss that feels very smooth to play for about 80% of the game. Then there's that last 20% that almost ruined it for me. The final dungeon takes twice as long as nearly any dungeon that precedes it, and 90% of your time is spent playing the game Portal. To be fair, the dungeon is still well designed, but somewhere on the 20th Portal puzzle, I was ready to throw my controller. It just feels never ending, and I have no idea what the developers were smoking when they designed this. And when you think you're finally about to beat the game, you have to go on a collectathon mission through each zone of the overworld to find the items you need to make a weapon to fight the final boss. Of all things to copy, I have no idea why the developers wanted to copy the Triforce collection quest from Wind Waker. If you do push through, however, you are rewarded with an excellent final boss, though for me, I don't think it makes up for that last 20%. Nevertheless, upon completing the game, I did realize I enjoyed my experience, but not to the point where I'm interested in exploring any of its sequels. I do think I can finally see why so many people love this game. It has fun combat, a unique story, and is very well designed. However, I would love to hear comments from those who've beaten Darksiders about what they think of the game and whether the sequels are worth playing. In any case, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. This has been Harlan Gaming, out.